The morning light spilled through the enormous glass windows of the Caldwell estate, soft and golden, touching the marble floor like something sacred. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of an antique clock and the distant hum of machines that helped the billionaire's twins breathe easier. Ethan Caldwell stood by the window, holding a cup of untouched coffee, his reflection a mixture of success and sorrow. For years, he had tried to fill the silence of his mansion with innovation, wealth, and doctors flown in from across the world. Yet nothing could fix what he feared most, the quietness of his children. Born paralyzed and mute, they had never spoken his name, never taken a single step toward him. They sat now in their wheelchairs near the window, sunlight painting their still faces, their small fingers twitching when a breeze moved the curtains. Then came a sound, barely there at first, a humming. It drifted from the kitchen, low and warm, like the whisper of a lullaby carried on morning air. The maid, Grace, moved quietly, folding linens, her humming steady as a heartbeat. She was not young and not new to sorrow. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing and her hair streaked with silver, but there was peace in her presence. She paused by the twins, kneeling gently beside them. "Good morning, my stars," she said softly. Her voice was not loud, yet it carried through the marble hall like music. The boy blinked. The girl's lips trembled, almost shaping a sound. Grace smiled, as if she had been waiting for that tiny miracle all along. Ethan noticed the way she touched their hands, not with pity, but with understanding. She pointed toward the window, and the children followed her gesture, watching the sunlight as if seeing it for the first time. Grace lifted her hand, open and slow, then lowered it, a silent rhythm they had learned together. Her lips moved quietly, forming words without sound. The girl mirrored her, repeating the motion. Ethan's breath caught. He stepped forward, but stopped at the doorway, afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile thing was unfolding. Grace did not turn. She simply kept moving her hands, whispering without words, and the twins' eyes followed her every motion. The boy's fingers lifted, just slightly, like the flutter of a new leaf in spring. Grace smiled again, and for a moment the morning light seemed to brighten, as if the house itself had decided to breathe. Ethan set his cup down, his hands trembling. The sound of the ticking clock faded. For the first time in years, hope made a sound in that room, and it came not from machines or medicine, but from the quiet miracle of a woman who believed that silence could be taught to sing. The next morning, the house woke slowly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile hope that had bloomed the day before. Ethan Caldwell sat in his study surrounded by books he never read, and reports from specialists that all said the same thing: irreversible, incurable, unchangeable. He stared at the papers, his jaw tight, the words blurring together until they meant nothing. Outside the open door, faint laughter drifted down the hall, so soft he almost thought it was the wind. He rose, following the sound until he reached the playroom, a place that had felt like a museum for years. Grace knelt on the rug between the twins. A basket of wooden blocks sat nearby, bright colors glowing under the morning sunday. She placed one block on the floor and waited. The boy, Liam, blinked twice, then slowly raised his trembling hand. His fingers brushed the block and nudged it forward. Grace clapped softly, her eyes bright. The girl, Lila, let out a quiet sound, not quite a word, but something real. Ethan froze in the doorway, torn between disbelief and awe. "They are responding to me," Grace said gently, sensing his presence. Her tone was calm, not boastful. "Their minds are awake. They just need to be spoken to differently." Ethan stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the rug. "Doctors have tried every method," he said. "There are no signs of improvement." Grace looked up at him with patience that came from pain long healed. "Sometimes improvement does not come in charts, sir. Sometimes it comes in eyes." Her gaze shifted to the twins, who watched her hands as she signed simple shapes in the air. Circle, heart, star. The children followed her gestures, their heads tilting in unison, fascinated by the silent dance. Ethan wanted to believe, but reason clawed at him. He reminded himself that progress this fast was impossible, yet his heart argued with his logic. Grace returned her attention to the children, humming softly. The tune was old, a melody of comfort passed down through generations. The room glowed with afternoon light, golden and forgiving. For the first time, the walls no longer felt sterile. Still, When Ethan spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who had lost faith too many times. "I do not want them given false hope," Grace nodded. "Hope cannot be false when it is the only thing that keeps you moving." He had no answer. Later that day, the family physician arrived for his routine check. Dr. Malden was brisk and clinical, his words always trimmed of emotion. He examined the twins, tapped his pen against the clipboard, and frowned. "No significant change," he declared. Grace stood quietly behind him, her hands clasped. "Their eyes are following movement more," she said softly, "and they have started responding to rhythm." The doctor gave a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "Coincidence, perhaps. Reflexes can mimic awareness." Ethan nodded reluctantly, the scientist in him aligning with the doctor's reasoning. After the physician left, Grace remained by the window, her reflection merging with the fading light. She whispered to herself, "Reflexes can still be the beginning of miracles." That evening, Ethan sat in the dining room, eating alone as always. The clinking of silverware echoed too loudly. Across the hall, he could hear Grace reading aloud not with sound, but with gestures and expressions. The twins watched her intently. Every so often, a faint sound escaped from them, like the start of laughter. He set down his fork, unable to eat. Something was happening that science could not explain, and it both terrified and moved him. He rose, walking quietly to the doorway. Grace turned slightly, surprised to see him, but continued her rhythm. She drew an invisible sun in the air, then placed her hand on her chest. "Warm," she said softly, enunciating each word. The twins mimicked her movement, their small fingers trembling but determined. "Warm," the girl repeated, her voice fragile yet clear enough to pierce the stillness. Ethan covered his mouth, his eyes burning. Grace did not look at him, but her voice grew gentler. "You see, sir," she said after a moment, "they have been waiting for someone to speak their language." He nodded slowly, unable to find words. Later, when the house had gone quiet again, he walked into the nursery. The moonlight spilled across the floor, pale and soft. The twins were asleep, their faces peaceful. Grace had left a small wooden star on the table beside them, carved by hand, rough around the edges but beautiful. He picked it up, tracing its shape. For years he had believed in equations, formulas, and logic. Now he was faced with something both terrifying and simple faith. As he stood there, the clock struck 10, and somewhere down the hall, Grace's humming returned, gentle as a prayer. Ethan looked once more at his children, then whispered to the dark, "Maybe she is right." And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like the richest man in the room. He felt like a father learning how to listen. The next few days passed quietly, but the rhythm of the house had changed. There was something new in the air, something almost invisible but alive. The morning routines that once echoed with silence were now touched by small sounds, the soft tapping of blocks, the faint hum of a tune, and the occasional laugh that slipped through like sunlight through cracked blinds. Grace continued her gentle work with the twins each morning. She no longer used medical equipment or devices that blinked and beeped. Instead, she relied on rhythm and patience, on human connection. She would sit cross-legged on the rug between Liam and Lila, clapping her hands once, then waiting. Liam's eyes followed the movement. Lila's fingers twitched. When they responded, Grace would smile as if they had spoken full sentences. Ethan often stood unseen at the doorway, watching, his arms folded. The logical part of him wanted to dismiss what he saw as coincidence, but the father inside him whispered otherwise. Every gesture from his children now carried meaning, and every small change tugged at something buried deep within him. One afternoon, Grace introduced music into their lesson. She brought an old wooden box wrapped in velvet cloth. When she opened it, inside lay a music box, its gears shining faintly under the light. She turned the key, and a simple melody began to play, pure and fragile. The twins stared, transfixed. Grace leaned closer and whispered, "Listen with your hearts." The notes drifted through the room, gentle and slow, filling every corner of the air that had once felt heavy. Ethan entered quietly, standing behind them. The song pulled him back to memories of his late wife humming that very same tune while decorating the nursery years ago. His chest tightened as the melody wrapped around him like a ghost of the past. When the song ended, Grace took Liam's hand and guided it toward the box. "Turn," she said slowly, showing him how. His small fingers trembled, but they moved. The box clicked, the melody started again, and Lila giggled, a sound that startled even her. Grace clapped softly, tears welling in her eyes. "See, you are making music," she said. Ethan could not move. The words hit something sacred in him. That night, he asked Grace to join him for tea in the library. She hesitated but followed. The firelight flickered across the walls lined with books. "Tell me," he said quietly, "how did you learn to reach them this way?" Grace folded her hands on her lap. "I learned to listen to what is not spoken," she said. "I worked for years in a children's hospital in Georgia. Many could not move or speak, but they still heard everything. They just needed someone who believed the silence was not empty." Ethan studied her face. "And you left that work?" She nodded. "After my son passed, I could not bear the sound of hospital machines anymore. But when I saw your children, I felt something calling me again." He leaned back in his chair, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I have had every expert, every therapist, every machine, but I never thought to simply believe." Grace smiled faintly. "Faith is also a kind of medicine, sir, but it only works when shared." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The moment hung between them, fragile and full of understanding. The next morning, Ethan joined them on the floor. He sat beside his children awkwardly at first, his expensive suit looking out of place against the rug scattered with toys. Grace guided him gently. "Clap once," she said. He did. The twins looked up, curious. "Now wait," Grace said. After a moment, Liam clapped once. Then Lila followed. Ethan laughed, startled by the sound. "They are answering me," he said softly. Grace nodded. "They always were. You just could not hear it before." By evening, Ethan canceled a meeting for the first time in years. He told his assistant he had more important work at home. That night, the house glowed differently. Grace sang quietly while preparing dinner, her voice blending with the sound of rain on the roof. The twins watched her from their seats, and Ethan found himself humming along without realizing it. The maids and butlers noticed the change too. The atmosphere was no longer cold and formal, it was human. Later, as the family settled for the night, Grace passed by the study. Ethan was still awake, staring at the carved wooden star she had left by the children's bed. When he looked up, his voice was softer than before. "Grace, whatever it is you are doing, keep doing it." She nodded once, smiling. "I am not performing miracles, sir. I am just reminding them that they still belong to this world." Ethan looked down at the star again, his reflection faint on its surface. "Then maybe I need reminding too." As she left the room, Grace whispered something almost too quiet to hear. "We all do." The fire crackled behind him, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt warmth that had nothing to do with money or power. It was the kind of warmth that only love, faith, and the steady hands of a woman who believed in unseen light could create. The first chill of autumn crept across the Caldwell estate as the trees began to change color. Mornings arrived wrapped in fog, and the gardens shimmered with dew. Inside the mansion, the rhythm of life had softened into something warm and fragile. The twins continued their small victories, guided each day by Grace's calm patience. Ethan had started joining their lessons, though he still carried his old doubts like a shadow. One afternoon, he sat by the window reading reports from the hospital that had treated his children for years. Every page reminded him of sterile rooms, emotionless voices, and the unspoken sentence that nothing could ever change. He set the papers aside and walked toward the playroom. The sunlight spilled across the rug, where Grace sat with the twins. She had arranged cups, spoons, and ribbons, creating a simple game that blended color and sound. "Blue means calm," she said softly, "and red means strong." The twins followed her rhythm, smiling faintly when she laughed. Ethan leaned against the doorway, his heart tightening. He wondered how something so gentle could accomplish what science had failed to do. After their lesson, Grace gathered the cups and noticed him watching. "Would you like to help with their walk?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "They cannot walk." Grace smiled. "Then we helped them try." In the garden, the wind carried the scent of damp leaves. Grace wheeled Liam and Lila to a flat patch of grass near the fountain. She removed their shoes and knelt between them. "Let us feel the earth," she said softly. She placed her palms on the grass, and after a moment, the twins copied her. Their fingers sank into the cool soil. "We remember with touch," she explained to Ethan. "Sometimes the body remembers what the mind forgot." Ethan knelt beside them, his expensive suit brushing against the dirt. For a man who had built an empire through control, kneeling in the soil beside his children felt like surrender, but it was the first kind of surrender that did not hurt. Grace began to hum a melody again, the same tune from the music box. The twins' eyes fluttered. Their breathing matched her rhythm. Then, in a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed, Lila's right foot twitched. Grace's voice trembled. "Do you see?" Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "It could be a spasm," he whispered. "Or it could be faith," she replied. He looked at her, unsure which frightened him more. That night, as the house grew quiet, Ethan found Grace in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. He leaned on the counter, watching her rinse a dish. "You speak as though you have seen miracles before," he said. Grace paused, her hands still under the running water. "I have seen something close," she answered. "When my son was 5, doctors said he would never speak again after an illness took his voice. But one day, while I was humming in the garden, he joined me. Only one note, but it was enough to change everything. He passed away a year later, but I never forgot that sound." Her voice trembled but did not break. Ethan stood silently, the weight of her story settling over him. "I am sorry," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "Do not be. Sorrow is a teacher too." Over the next week, their lessons continued outdoors whenever the weather allowed. Grace introduced gentle exercises for the twins. She guided their hands, taught them to stretch, to move, to breathe with intention. The progress was small but real. The doctors who visited still dismissed it as coincidence. Yet even they could not ignore the spark of awareness in the children's eyes. One morning, Ethan's sister, Margaret, came to visit unannounced. She had always disapproved of Grace, calling her methods unorthodox. She entered the playroom and froze at the sight of Grace sitting cross-legged on the floor, the twins laughing silently as she taught them sign for the word, home. Margaret crossed her arms. "This is not therapy. It is sentiment." Grace looked up calmly. "Sometimes sentiment is what saves people, ma'am." Ethan arrived moments later, drawn by the raised voices. "Margaret," he said firmly, "Grace stays." His sister looked startled. "You are letting a maid replace your doctors?" Ethan met her eyes. "No, I am letting her remind my children they are alive." Margaret left without another word. After she was gone, Grace sighed softly. "People fear what they cannot measure." Ethan nodded. "So did I," he admitted, "until I realized life does not always fit in a chart." That evening, rain began to fall, gentle and steady. Grace sat with the twins near the fireplace, holding their hands as the flames flickered. Ethan joined them without being asked. He placed his hands over his children's and closed his eyes. Grace began to hum again, and soon the twins joined her, their soft voices weaving through the sound of rain and fire. When the song ended, Ethan opened his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Grace looked at him and said, "It is not me, sir. It is them. They just needed someone to believe first." The wind rattled the windows, but inside the house, peace had taken root, quiet and strong, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil. The days that followed were filled with a quiet determination. The rhythm of the house had transformed completely. It was no longer ruled by the ticking of clocks or the schedules of doctors, but by the pulse of small victories. Grace began each morning the same way, with sunlight spilling across the room and the faint hum of a hymn she sang while preparing breakfast. She had started teaching the twins how to feed themselves, something the medical staff had always done for them. Her approach was slow, patient, and full of encouragement. "You hold the spoon like this," she said gently, guiding Lila's small fingers around the handle. Lila struggled, her hand shaking as she tried to lift the spoon to her mouth. A few drops spilled, but Grace clapped softly and smiled. "That is enough for today," she said, wiping the girl's chin tenderly. Liam watched closely, then mimicked his sister's motion. The sound of the spoon tapping the bowl was faint but steady, like a heartbeat returning after too long. Ethan watched from the doorway, no longer hiding his presence as he once did. He had begun to help Grace, without being asked. He poured milk, fetched napkins, and even learned to kneel beside his children, though the marble floor chilled his knees. For a man who once lived by numbers and power, every small act of care felt like an awakening. "You have changed the air in this house," he told Grace one evening as the children rested. She smiled and said, "It was not me, sir. You just opened the windows." That night, he sat by the twins' beds, reading from a children's book his wife used to love. His voice trembled as he reached the final lines, but both Liam and Lila looked at him, their eyes bright and alert. When he closed the book, Lila moved her lips and whispered something faint. It was not clear, but it was enough to make him lean closer, tears stinging his eyes. Grace entered quietly, carrying a small candle. "They are finding their voices," she said softly. "The words will come when they are ready." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. The next morning, Grace introduced something new. She brought a small drum she had borrowed from a local church. "Today, we will make music together," she said. She tapped a gentle rhythm and encouraged the twins to follow with wooden spoons. The sound was uneven, but it was alive. Liam laughed for the first time, a clear, warm sound that filled the room. Ethan froze, overwhelmed. Grace placed her hand on his arm and whispered, "That sound is worth more than any cure." Word of the children's progress began to spread quietly among the staff. The maids and gardeners started to pause outside the playroom, listening with smiles they could not contain. Even the old driver, who had served the family for decades, said, "The house finally feels like a home again." That afternoon, while Grace prepared lunch, Ethan found an old box in the attic. Inside were baby clothes, his wife's letters, and a family photograph taken before the twins' illness. He sat there for a long while, holding the picture, feeling the ache of years wasted in silence. When Grace entered to call him for lunch, she stopped at the doorway. "I did not mean to intrude," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "You brought them back to life, Grace. And somehow, you brought me back too." She looked down modestly. "We are all just trying to remember who we were before pain made us forget." That evening, Ethan gathered the staff in the main hall. "From now on," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "the twins will have their lessons outdoors every week. We will no longer treat them as patients, but as children." The staff nodded, their eyes glistening. Grace watched from behind the twins' wheelchairs, her expression calm but her heart full. The next day, they rolled the chairs out to the garden. The sky was a wide expanse of pale blue, and the scent of cut grass filled the air. Grace placed 2 small flowers in the twins' hands. "This is your first promise," she said. "A promise to keep growing." Lila looked at the flower, then turned to her brother. He reached out his hand, brushing her fingers. Ethan watched in silence, his heart swelling with something he could not name. Grace looked up at him and said softly, "Healing is not only about the body, it is about remembering how to love." As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting a golden glow over the garden, Ethan realized she was right. The mansion that once felt like a monument to loneliness now breathed with laughter, music, and hope. That night, before going to sleep, Grace placed a small notebook beside her bed and wrote a single line. "The greatest miracles happen when no one is watching." In the silence that followed, the sound of distant rain began, gentle and rhythmic, like the beating of 2 small hearts learning how to live again. Autumn deepened, painting the trees outside the Caldwell estate with shades of gold and red. The air grew cooler, and the mornings carried a mist that wrapped the garden in silence. Inside, warmth filled every corner of the mansion. The children were improving in small but remarkable ways, their laughter becoming more frequent, their eyes brighter each day. Ethan Caldwell found himself smiling more than he had in years. But peace, as Grace often said, is the most fragile gift of all. One afternoon, while Ethan was away at a business meeting, a new doctor arrived from the city. Dr. Harlow was young, confident, and full of theories. He had been hired months ago on a long-term contract, but this was his first visit since Grace had begun her work with the twins. When he entered the playroom, Grace was teaching Liam and Lila how to hold crayons. The twins were focused, their small hands trembling as they drew lines that curved like rivers across the paper. "This is progress," Grace said softly. They are learning to express what words cannot. Doctor. Harlow crossed his arms and smiled thinly. That may be so, but they need structured therapy, not nursery games. His tone was polite, but sharp. May I observe? Grace nodded, though her heart tensed. He watched as she guided the twins through a song, helping them move their arms to the rhythm. When the girl made a sound, a faint attempt at humming, the doctor wrote something on his clipboard and muttered, "Coincidence." Later that evening, when Ethan returned, Dr. Harlow requested a private meeting in the study. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, "I have reviewed the situation. The children's improvement is likely psychological. This maid of yours, Grace, means well, but she is using unverified techniques. You must understand that emotional attachment can create illusions of progress." Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Illusions do not laugh or draw or hum," he said quietly. The doctor frowned. "You are a man of science, sir. Surely you can see that these small responses do not equal recovery." "And yet," Ethan said, "no one else has given me what she has hope." The doctor sighed. "Hope is not a treatment. Neither," Ethan replied, "is doubt." Their conversation ended there, but the seed of conflict had been planted. 2 days later, while Grace was reading to the twins, the butler entered with an envelope. "A message from Mr. Caldwell," he said. Grace opened it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a note written in Ethan's precise handwriting. "Grace, I have been advised to suspend your lessons temporarily while the new treatment plan is reviewed." Her eyes filled with quiet sadness. She understood what this meant. Without a word, she folded the note, placed it in her pocket, and continued reading to the twins until they fell asleep. That evening, she packed her small suitcase. The next morning, when Ethan came down for breakfast, the playroom was silent. The toys were neatly arranged, the chairs empty. On the table, beside 2 crayons and a folded drawing, lay a single white envelope. Inside was a short letter. "Sir, I will never forget what your children have taught me. They are stronger than anyone believes. Sometimes love needs silence to be heard. Thank you for letting me try." Ethan stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hands. He turned toward the drawing she had left. It was a crude sketch, but clear enough to understand 2 children standing beside a woman holding their hands, all 3 beneath a tree full of golden leaves. He felt his throat tighten as he whispered her name, Grace. For the rest of that day, the house felt colder. The twins seemed unsettled, their usual spark gone. Lila refused to eat, and Liam sat staring at the door as though waiting for someone who would never return. When Dr. Harlow arrived for his scheduled session, the twins turned their faces away. He sighed impatiently and tried to engage them with flashcards, but their eyes remained distant. Ethan watched from across the room, his heart aching. That night, he sat alone in his study, the rain tapping against the window. He replayed every moment of the last few months, the first smile, the first sound, the laughter that had once filled the house. None of it felt like illusion. He opened the drawer where he had placed her letter and read it again. Sometimes love needs silence to be heard. He exhaled slowly, realization dawning like dawn itself. The next morning, he called for his car. The driver looked surprised when Ethan handed him an address written on a torn page. "Find her," Ethan said simply. "Bring her back." Hours later, as the car disappeared down the long driveway, the mansion stood in quiet stillness. In the playroom, the twins sat by the window, sunlight glinting off the crayons Grace had taught them to hold. On the paper between them, they had drawn something new, a house with an open door. Grace sat quietly in a small room above a bakery on the edge of town. The space was humble but filled with warmth, the scent of freshly baked bread drifting through the thin walls each morning. She had found temporary work helping the baker's wife with cleaning, her hands busy though her heart felt heavy. Each night she looked out the small window toward the distant lights of the Caldwell estate, wondering if the twins were still smiling or if the house had fallen back into silence. She missed them terribly but told herself that she had done the right thing. Sometimes stepping away was also a form of care. Meanwhile, at the mansion, the days stretched long and still. Without Grace's voice to fill the halls, the house felt hollow again. The twins grew restless. Lila refused to participate in therapy. turning her face away whenever Dr. Harlow entered. Liam no longer reached for his crayons or followed the rhythm of the drum. Their progress, once so steady, seemed to fade like breath on cold glass. Ethan tried to carry on, but his confidence faltered. One evening, he walked into the playroom after the children had gone to bed. The smell of crayons lingered faintly. On the table lay the drawing Grace had left behind, the one of her and the twins beneath the golden tree. He touched the paper gently, tracing the lines. His heart ached with an understanding he could no longer ignore. The next morning, he drove to the bakery himself. When he arrived, Grace was sweeping the floor, her hair tied back, her hands steady. She looked up in surprise, the broom pausing midair. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I should not have let you go." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were cautious. "You were only doing what you thought was best." "What I thought was best," he said, "was based on fear. I was afraid to believe in something that science could not explain." Grace leaned the broom against the wall and folded her hands. "Hope does not need proof, sir. It only needs faith." He nodded slowly. "The twins need you, and so do I." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she picked up her worn coat from a nearby chair. "Let us go home," she said. The drive back was quiet, the kind of silence that did not need words. When they arrived at the estate, the front doors opened, and the staff looked up in shock and relief. The twins were in the playroom, sitting by the window as they always did. When Grace stepped through the doorway, both children turned instantly. Lila's lips parted, and a small sound escaped a cry, soft but full of life. Liam reached forward, his hands trembling. Grace dropped to her knees, tears filling her eyes. "I missed you, my stars," she whispered. The twins moved toward her as best they could, their eyes shining. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. The light from the window framed them all in gold. For the first time, the mansion did not look like a place of wealth, but a home that had finally found its heart. Grace resumed her work that evening as if she had never left. She prepared the twins' supper and hummed as she did, the same lullaby that had once filled the halls with comfort. The children ate quietly, smiling between bites. Ethan joined them at the table, not as a businessman but as a father. After dinner, he followed Grace to the kitchen. "I spoke with Dr. Harlow," he said carefully. "I dismissed him this morning." Grace looked up, surprised. "Are you certain?" "Completely," he replied. "No chart or test can measure what you have done." Grace nodded, her eyes soft. "Then we begin again tomorrow." That night, Ethan stood outside the twins' room. Through the half-open door, he saw Grace sitting by their beds, telling them a story in her gentle, steady way. Her voice carried a peace that wrapped around the house like a blanket. He turned away quietly, afraid to disturb the moment. For the first time in years, he slept soundly. The next morning, sunlight poured into the playroom once more. Grace was already there, arranging small objects for the day's lesson. Ethan brought her a cup of tea. "You were right," he said. "Sometimes love needs silence to be heard." Grace smiled, the morning light catching in her eyes. And sometimes silence needs love to be broken. In that simple exchange, something shifted forever. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed again, full of laughter, warmth, and the soft, unspoken music that only faith and kindness could create. Winter sunlight filtered through the wide windows of the Caldwell mansion, turning the air golden. The house was alive again, filled with small sounds that once seemed impossible. The twins had begun to make soft words, faint but clear enough to melt hearts. Liam could say the word, warm, and Lila could whisper, light. Ethan would often stop whatever he was doing just to listen, afraid that the moment might vanish if he blinked. Grace continued to guide them with the same patience she always carried, her voice gentle, her hands steady. Each morning began with lessons, songs, and laughter. Yet beneath the peace there was still a quiet fear, the kind that comes when one realizes how fragile miracles can be. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Grace sat near the fireplace, braiding Lila's hair while Liam played with wooden blocks. Ethan entered the room holding a cup of tea, his expression softer than it had been in years. He stood near them for a moment before speaking. "Grace," he said quietly, "I want to make a promise." She looked up, surprised by his tone. "A promise?" He nodded, setting the cup down. "Yes, I will not stop until they can say one more word, Dad. I want to hear that word before the year ends." Grace smiled gently. "Then let us make that our shared promise," she said. "I will not rest until it happens." The twins looked between them, sensing the warmth in the air. Lila reached for Grace's hand, her small fingers curling tightly. "Dad," she tried to say, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan froze, his breath catching. The sound was incomplete, but it was enough to bring tears to his eyes. Grace pressed her hand to her heart. "It has begun," she whispered. From that day forward, every lesson carried a new intensity. Grace used everything she could think of to bring sound and feeling to their world. She played simple piano notes, taught them to repeat rhythm with claps and hums, and spoke each word slowly, letting them see how her lips moved. Ethan often joined her, learning alongside his children. "Say the word with me," Grace would say, her voice calm. "Dad." The twins tried, their voices weak but determined. Each attempt felt like a spark in the dark, small but growing. The progress was slow, yet every sound carried hope. At night, when the house grew still, Grace would sit by the twins' beds and whisper stories about stars and angels, reminding them that every light begins small before it learns to shine. Ethan often stood by the doorway, unseen, listening. Sometimes he would whisper quietly to himself, repeating the same promise, "I will wait, as long as it takes." One morning, after weeks of practice, Grace arrived early to find Ethan already in the playroom. He was kneeling on the rug, helping Liam stack blocks into a tower. "You beat me to it," she said, smiling. "I could not sleep," he admitted. "They dreamed of you last night. Lila said your name in her sleep." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Then they are learning to speak through dreams first," she said softly. The lesson that day went longer than usual. Grace had drawn a simple picture of a man holding two children by the hand. Beneath it, she had written one word, "Dad." She pointed to the picture, then to Ethan, then to her mouth. "Dad," she said clearly. The twins followed her gaze. Lila's lips moved first. "Duh," she whispered. Liam's small voice joined hers. "Duh." Ethan fell still, tears streaming silently. Grace kept her voice calm, guiding them through it again and again until both children could make the sound without hesitation. It was not perfect, but it was beautiful. Afterward, Grace helped them rest, tucking blankets around their legs. Ethan turned to her and said, "I do not know how to thank you." She shook her head gently. "You already have, sir. You believed." That evening, as snow continued to fall, Ethan lit a fire in the grand hall. He called the entire staff together. When Grace entered, he turned toward her. "This woman," he said, "has given my children something no medicine ever could." She gave them a voice. The staff clapped softly, their faces full of admiration. Grace lowered her gaze, humbled. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, she stood by the window watching the snowfall. Ethan joined her quietly. "You once told me that healing is remembering how to love," he said. "Yes," she replied. "And love is remembering you are not alone." They stood there for a long moment, the snow outside glowing beneath the moonlight. For the first time in years, Ethan felt peace, not the kind born of success, but the kind that comes when a heart learns to hope again. The twins slept soundly upstairs, their dreams filled with warmth and light, their voices still growing stronger in the quiet rhythm of Grace's promise. The snow melted slowly, and with it came the soft breath of spring. The gardens around the Caldwell mansion began to bloom again, and the air filled with the scent of fresh earth and lilacs. The season seemed to mirror the change inside the house. The once quiet halls were now alive with warmth and laughter. Grace kept a steady rhythm to each day, beginning with songs in the morning and ending with stories at night. The twins responded more each week, their words still tender and halting but now steady enough to fill the room with joy. Liam's first full word had been son, and Lila's had been home. Ethan never tired of hearing them speak. He often paused in his work just to listen through the open door, smiling quietly to himself. Grace noticed how the mansion's staff, once distant and formal, had begun to change as well. The maids no longer walked briskly in silence. They now greeted the children with soft smiles. Even the head butler, who had never shown emotion in decades of service, had been seen slipping a small toy to Liam when no one was looking. Grace felt the shift like a melody unfolding, gentle, healing, unstoppable. One morning, sunlight streamed across the breakfast table where Ethan sat with his children. Grace poured juice for them, and Lila looked up at her father. "Dad," she said clearly. Ethan froze, his heart caught between disbelief and awe. It was the first time she had said it without prompting. Liam followed with a small laugh, repeating, "Dad, Dad." Ethan reached for both of their hands, unable to speak. Grace stood quietly behind him, tears shining in her eyes. Later that day, she found him standing alone by the piano in the study. He was staring at an old photograph of his late wife holding the twins as infants. "She would have loved this," he said softly. Grace nodded. "She still does," she replied. "Love does not end, sir. It changes shape." He turned toward her, his eyes filled with gratitude that words could not express. As spring deepened, Grace began introducing new routines. She taught the twins to identify scents: lavender, cinnamon, rosewater. She guided their hands through cooking simple things, letting them feel textures, measure flour, and stir batter. The kitchen filled with laughter, flour on their cheeks, and the sound of spoons clinking against bowls. The cook, Mrs. Evans, watched from the corner with tears in her eyes. "It feels like the house has been asleep for years," she whispered to Grace. "And now it is finally awake." Grace smiled. Children have a way of waking hearts, too. That evening, as the sun set, Ethan suggested a walk through the garden. Grace wrapped scarves around the twins, and they followed the cobblestone path that wound past the fountain. Birds fluttered overhead, and the smell of grass was thick in the air. Liam pointed toward a flower just beginning to bloom. "Blue," he said proudly. Grace laughed. "Yes, that is blue." Lila bent down and touched the petals gently. "Soft," she whispered. Ethan looked at Grace and said quietly, "Every day feels new." She nodded. "That is because they are learning to see the world as it truly is." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the children explore. Ethan thought about how far they had come from the stillness of hospital rooms to this garden filled with sound and life. "I used to think miracles came from breakthroughs," he said. "Now I see they come from people." Grace turned toward him. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the greatest miracles come from broken hearts that decide to heal anyway." The following week, the twins took their first short car ride to the nearby park. It was a bright Saturday morning, and the city was alive with families, laughter, and the smell of popcorn from a street cart. Grace helped Liam and Lila onto a blanket under a large oak tree. They watched other children run and play, their eyes wide with curiosity. Ethan sat beside them, his hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder. "You can play too," he said gently. Grace smiled and nodded in encouragement. Lila reached for a small ball that had rolled near them. She pushed it forward toward Liam, who caught it between his hands. The simple motion drew applause from a few nearby parents who had been watching. Grace felt her chest swell with pride. "They are part of the world now," she whispered. On the drive home, both children fell asleep in the back seat, their heads resting against each other. Grace turned to Ethan and said, "Do you remember when they would not even look outside the window?" "I do," he said quietly. "Now I think they are teaching me how to live." That evening, as twilight filled the mansion, Grace sat in her small room writing in her notebook. She wrote, "Today, they spoke, laughed, and touched the sky with their eyes." She closed the book and looked out the window toward the stars. Down the hall, Ethan tucked the twins into bed. Lila murmured something soft before drifting off. It sounded like, "Thank you." Ethan stood for a long time, watching them breathe, then whispered, "No, thank you." The mansion was quiet again, but this time it was not an empty silence. It was the peace that follows music, the sound of a home finally learning how to rest after years of longing. The bright calm of spring slowly gave way to the restless warmth of early summer. The garden that had once been filled with soft laughter now echoed with stronger voices as Liam and Lila began to test the limits of their newfound freedom. Grace had started physical exercises for them in the mornings. Each day began with sunlight through the wide windows and a gentle melody from the piano that kept rhythm as she guided their movements. Ethan would often watch from the hallway, his heart tight with hope and fear all at once. On one particular morning, Grace arranged a soft rug in the living room, spreading cushions to keep the children safe. "We are going to try something new today," she said with her usual calm confidence. "You will both learn how to stand for a little longer." Liam's eyes widened while Lila smiled faintly, clutching the stuffed bear that never left her side. Ethan walked in carrying 2 small handrails that the family carpenter had made. "These might help," he said, setting them down gently. Grace nodded in gratitude. "We will use them slowly," she said. With careful support, she placed the twins' feet flat on the rug and held their hands. "You are strong," she whispered to them. "Feel the ground beneath you. It will hold you." Lila trembled but managed to push herself up for a moment, her knees shaking. Liam followed, his small fingers gripping Grace's hands tightly. The air in the room held still, like the pause between 2 heartbeats. "You are doing it," Grace said softly. Ethan stepped closer, his breath caught. But before he could say anything, Lila's legs gave way, and she fell gently onto the rug. There was no harm, but the shock broke the fragile confidence that had filled the room. Lila's eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from frustration. "No," she said weakly. Grace knelt beside her, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Falling means you are trying," she said, "and trying means you are alive." Ethan watched silently, torn between admiration and fear. That afternoon, a doctor came for the routine checkup. He examined the twins and spoke with concern. "You are pushing them too far," he said to Ethan. "Their muscles are still delicate. Overexertion can cause strain or even nerve damage." Grace stood quietly in the corner, listening. "I am careful," she said softly. "They want to try, and they are ready." The doctor shook his head. "Optimism is not medicine. You must be cautious." After he left, Ethan turned to Grace, conflicted. "He might be right," he said. "I could not bear to see them hurt again." Grace's expression softened. "Fear will always find a reason to stop love," she said, "but love moves anyway." The next morning, Grace suggested a slower routine, blending music and movement. The twins sat on the rug, clapping softly to the rhythm of her song. The energy returned to the room, but Ethan still felt uneasy. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees, the children begged for one more round of walking practice. "Just one more," Lila said, smiling up at her father. He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, one more." Grace steadied them again, moving carefully, but this time something was different. Lila managed to take a small, steady step forward without Grace holding her. The moment froze in the golden light. Ethan's heart leapt. "You did it," he whispered. Liam tried next, wobbling but following his sister's lead. Both children laughed, their voices pure and bright. But then, in their excitement, Lila took another step too quickly. Her balance failed, and she fell sideways onto the rug. The laughter stopped. Grace rushed to her, checking for any injury. "You are all right," she said quickly, her voice calm but trembling slightly. Ethan's pulse raced. "Enough," he said firmly. "No more for today." Grace nodded, though sadness flickered in her eyes. Later that night, Ethan sat in his study, guilt gnawing at him. He could still hear Lila's soft sobs when she thought no one was listening. Grace entered quietly, her hands folded. "She is fine," she said. "Just frightened." Ethan sighed. "I cannot do this again. The idea of losing progress terrifies me." Grace stepped closer. "Do you remember what you told me the day we made the promise?" He looked at her blankly. "You said you would not stop until they could say the word Dad. You did not say you would only try when it was safe." Her words settled heavy in the air. He nodded slowly, understanding that fear had once again become his cage. "I trust you," he said finally. The next morning, Grace found the twins awake early, whispering to each other. When she entered, Lila smiled shyly and said, "Walk again." Grace looked at Ethan, who stood by the doorway. He took a deep breath and said, "Yes, my love, we will try again." The day's light filled the room like a blessing. This time, Grace guided them gently, one slow step at a time. Lila held her brother's hand, their fingers intertwined. Ethan watched as they moved together, fragile yet unstoppable. When they fell, they laughed instead of crying. Grace smiled, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "See?" she said. "Even falling can sound like music." By the end of the day, the fear that had hung over them began to fade. The mansion once again pulsed with the rhythm of hope, a sound more beautiful than any song. The heartbeat of a family learning that strength was never the absence of pain but the courage to keep rising after the fall. The days following the fall were quiet, filled with the kind of stillness that comes after both progress and fear. Grace noticed how Ethan grew more thoughtful, often standing by the window long after the lessons ended. The twins had recovered physically, but something deeper had shifted in the air. There was caution now, an invisible hesitation in every movement. Grace knew it well. It was the same kind of fear that lived in people who had once lost everything. One evening, she found Ethan in the study, staring at the fire as it flickered low. "You are carrying too much on your shoulders," she said gently. He did not look up. "They are my children. Every breath they take reminds me how fragile life is." Grace stepped closer. Fragility is not weakness. Sometimes it is the proof that life still wants to fight. He glanced at her, his eyes tired. "And what if I am the reason they fall again?" Grace smiled softly. "Then you will help them rise again. That is what fathers do." The next morning, rain fell over the estate, soft and steady. The sound of water against the windows made the mansion feel smaller, more intimate. Grace began their lesson indoors. She set up a few candles and turned off the bright lights. "We will listen today," she said. The twins looked curious. "Listen to what?" Liam asked, his small voice uncertain. "To silence," she replied. "It can tell you things words never could." They closed their eyes, and for a moment there was only the sound of rain and breath. After a while, Grace spoke again. "When I was little," she said softly, "my grandmother told me that God hides answers in silence. You have to be brave enough to sit still and hear them." Ethan stood in the doorway, watching. Something about the stillness of that room, the flicker of candles, the reflection of rain on the floor pulled at him. He remembered the nights he had prayed when the twins were first diagnosed, begging for a sign. Back then, silence had felt like punishment. Now, as he looked at Grace and his children sitting together in calm stillness, it felt like peace. Later that night, the storm deepened. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the old windows. The children grew frightened, their eyes wide with each flash of light. Grace rushed to their room and sat between them, her arms open. "It is only the sky speaking loudly," she said softly. "It will pass." Lila trembled. "I do not like the noise," she whispered. Grace smiled. "Then let us make our own sound to keep it away." She began to hum, the same tune she had sung since the first day she met them. Liam joined first, his small voice shaky but clear. Lila followed, and soon the room filled with a fragile melody that rose above the storm. Ethan stood at the doorway again, listening as the children's voices wove through Grace's. He closed his eyes and felt something shift inside him. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and clean. The twins were full of energy, eager to play. Grace decided to take them out into the garden, where the ground was soft and wet. "Do you see the puddles?" she asked. "They are small mirrors." The children laughed as they bent down to see their reflections. "We are here," Liam said proudly. Ethan walked toward them, carrying a large umbrella. "Careful, the ground is slippery," he said. Grace looked up and smiled. "Sometimes slipping teaches balance," she said. He chuckled softly. The twins began to play a small game, stepping carefully around the puddles, their hands clasped together. Grace and Ethan watched them for a long time. When the lesson ended, the family returned inside. Grace brewed tea while Ethan dried the twins' feet and wrapped them in blankets. The gesture was simple, but Grace noticed how his hands moved gently, no longer full of tension. "You are learning," she said with a smile. "Learning what?" he asked. "That love is not about protection alone," she said. "It is about presence." That evening, as the sky darkened again, Grace sat by her window, writing in her notebook. She wrote, "Today, they faced the storm and found their own sound. Healing is not always in silence, but in learning how to sing when thunder comes." Down the hall, Ethan tucked the twins into bed. Lila looked up at him and asked, "Will the thunder come back?" He nodded. "It always does." "Then will we sing again?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Yes, every single time." When he stepped out of their room, he paused outside Grace's door. He could hear her soft humming through the wall, the same tune that now lived in every corner of the mansion. It was no longer the song of a maid or even a caregiver. It was the anthem of a home reborn from pain. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized that faith did not come from answers but from learning to listen long enough to hear love inside the noise. And as he walked down the quiet hallway, the faint echo of the twins' laughter followed him like a prayer. Spring slowly turned into early summer, and the mansion seemed to glow with a quiet peace that came from love finally taking root. The garden was in full bloom again. Birds nested in the oak trees, and laughter filled the halls every morning. Grace had settled back into her rhythm, guiding the twins through their daily routines with patience and light in her eyes. Each day felt like a small victory, every step a miracle rediscovered. Ethan often joined them during lessons now, kneeling beside his children and clapping in rhythm as they practiced movement. His voice, once cold and commanding, had grown gentle. Grace sometimes watched him when he was not looking, seeing a man no longer weighed down by his own walls. On one bright morning, Grace entered the playroom carrying a small music box. "Today," she said softly, "we will celebrate." The twins looked curious. "Celebrate what?" Liam asked. "The word you gave your father," she said with a smile. Lila giggled. "Dad," she whispered, proud of herself. Ethan stepped forward, placing his hand over his heart. "You have no idea what that means to me," he said, his voice unsteady. Grace wound the key of the music box, and a familiar melody began to play, the same one that had filled their home months ago when everything still seemed impossible. She whispered, "Every note of this song belongs to your strength." The twins listened with wide eyes, swaying gently to the sound. Then something unexpected happened. Lila's small hand reached out for Grace's, and she whispered, "Dance." Grace laughed softly. "I have not danced in years." Ethan extended his hand. "Then it is time you did." For a brief moment, hesitation crossed her face, but then she placed her hand in his. The music filled the room as they moved slowly, gracefully, their steps careful but full of warmth. The twins clapped and laughed, the light from the windows turning everything gold. Grace's heart swelled with gratitude. It felt as though the universe had exhaled, finally releasing every sorrow she had once carried. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Grace took the twins out into the garden. She had placed soft blankets on the grass and brought small bells tied to ribbons. "We will make our own music," she said, handing them each a bell. The children shook them gently, giggling as the sound floated through the air. "The world sings when you do," Grace said. "Remember that, my stars." Ethan joined them, lying on the blanket beside his children. The sky above shimmered with the first stars of evening. "Tell me, Grace," he said quietly, "do you ever miss your son?" Grace looked at the sky for a long moment before answering. "Every day," she whispered, "but I no longer feel the ache as loss. I feel it as love that changed shape." Ethan nodded slowly. "I think I understand now." They sat together in the fading light, surrounded by the sound of bells and laughter. Later that week, Grace noticed something remarkable. During their morning exercises, Liam suddenly lifted himself from his chair, his legs trembling but holding steady. She froze, her breath catching. "Ethan," she called softly. He turned from his desk and saw what was happening. His heart nearly stopped. "Liam," he whispered, "you are standing." The boy's knees wobbled, but he took one slow step forward. Grace's hands covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "You are walking," she whispered. Lila clapped and laughed, shouting, "He walks." Ethan fell to his knees beside his son, his arms open but careful not to touch him too soon. Liam reached forward, his small hand brushing his father's shoulder before he fell gently into his embrace. The moment froze in golden light, filled with joy too deep for words. That evening, the entire house seemed to glow. The staff whispered excitedly, unable to contain their amazement. Grace sat in her small room later that night, her hands shaking as she wrote in her notebook. Today, a miracle walked across the floor. She looked toward the window, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet night. Down the hall, Ethan sat by the twins' beds, holding their hands as they slept. The house was completely still except for the faint sound of the music box playing one more time. When Grace passed by their room before going to sleep, she saw Ethan looking at the ceiling, whispering something softly. "For the first time in my life," he said, "I am not asking for more. I am only saying thank you." The light from the hallway fell across his face, and for a moment, Grace saw not a billionaire, but a father redeemed by love and faith. She closed the door quietly, leaving them in peace. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby, and somewhere in the distance, a single star shone brighter than the rest, as if watching over the small miracles happening below. The days that followed Liam's first steps felt like a dream stitched into reality. Everyone in the Caldwell mansion moved as if careful not to wake from it. Lila practiced her balance beside her brother, determined to follow him, and Grace guided both children with the patience of someone who had learned to measure progress in heartbeats instead of miles. Ethan could not stop smiling. He told the staff to let the children's laughter echo through the halls, to open every curtain, to let the sunlight in. Hope had become the new language of the house. But news has a way of traveling, even when no one intends for it to. One morning, while Grace prepared breakfast, the family's longtime driver, Mr. Slace Harris, entered the kitchen holding his phone with trembling hands. "Grace," he said, his voice shaking with surprise, "someone posted a video." Grace frowned. "What video?" He turned the screen toward her. There, on the small glowing display, was a clip taken secretly by a visiting therapist weeks earlier. It showed Liam standing, taking those few miraculous steps into his father's arms. The caption read, "The billionaire's paralyzed twins are walking again thanks to the Maid's miracle." Grace's stomach turned. The video was spreading fast, already reaching thousands of views. Within hours, calls began flooding the mansion. Journalists, reporters, and curious onlookers demanded details. By noon, a black van with the logo of a local news station parked at the gate. Ethan, unaware at first, walked into the commotion as staff tried to turn the reporters away. "Mr. Caldwell," one shouted, "is it true that your maid cured your children?" Another voice followed. "How much are you paying her? Is she a healer? A fraud?" The chaos sent a chill through the air. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who released this?" he asked sharply. Grace stepped forward, her hands trembling. "It was not me," she said softly. "I would never—" "I know," he interrupted, but his tone carried tension. He turned to his head of security. "Get them out of here." Cameras flashed through the gates, voices shouting questions until the doors slammed shut. Grace stood frozen, guilt pressing down even though she had done nothing wrong. That evening, Ethan paced the study, his phone ringing endlessly. "This will ruin their privacy," he said under his breath. "They are children, not a story." Grace entered quietly, her expression weary, but calm. "It is only the truth that has been seen," she said. "You should not fear what is real." He looked at her, frustration clouding his face. "You do not understand. The world will twist it. They always do." "Then tell them the truth yourself," she replied. "Tell them it was not a miracle. Tell them it was love." He turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You think love will stop headlines?" "No," she said, "but it will stop shame." Silence filled the room. He rubbed his forehead, realizing she was right. Still, the next morning, news trucks lined the road outside the mansion. Reporters called out questions through the gates. Inside, the twins watched from the window, unaware of the world's noise, playing with their crayons. Grace refused to let the chaos steal their peace. "We will continue our lessons," she said firmly. The sound of laughter returned to the playroom, though a little softer now, as if guarded. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the children's former doctor, Dr. Harlow. His words were cold and formal, questioning Grace's methods and suggesting further medical investigation. Ethan crumpled the letter in his hand. "He only sees statistics," Grace said. "He cannot see souls." Ethan nodded, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "I will protect them," he said quietly. "Even from the truth if I must. But the truth, once released, cannot be contained." 2 days later, A journalist managed to slip past the gates, pretending to be a delivery driver. He snapped photos before being escorted out. That night, the images were everywhere: Grace with the twins in the garden, Ethan watching from behind them, the caption reading, "A maid's miracle defies medicine." Grace saw the story on the television in the kitchen and turned it off. She sat alone for a long time, staring at her hands. When Ethan found her, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have stopped this sooner." She shook her head. "Do not be sorry for the truth. Be sorry only if we stop living it." He nodded, but his heart ached. "The world can be cruel. Then we will be kind," she said simply. That night, as the house finally grew quiet, Grace tucked the twins into bed and whispered, "Tomorrow we will begin again." Down the hall, Ethan looked out at the flashing lights of the cameras beyond his gates. The world was watching, but for the first time, he did not feel anger. He felt fear, the kind that comes when one realizes how fragile goodness is under the weight of attention. He turned off the lights and whispered to the darkness, "They cannot take what they did not give." In another room, Grace wrote in her notebook, "Truth walks on its own feet. Let it go where it must." The night passed slowly, heavy with uncertainty, yet somewhere deep within the mansion, hope continued to hum like a soft, unbreakable song. The following days unfolded like a storm that refused to quiet. The world outside the Caldwell gates could not let the story rest. Headlines called Grace the miracle maid, and television hosts debated her methods as if kindness were a scandal. Reporters camped outside the estate, their lenses hungry for glimpses of the children. Grace stayed inside, shielding the twins from the noise. She drew the curtains tighter, spoke softer, and sang louder so the children would not hear the chaos that now surrounded their home. Ethan grew restless, pacing the hallways late at night, his once steady composure cracking under the pressure. "This is my fault," he said one evening, his voice low and heavy. "If I had protected them sooner, none of this would have happened." Grace stood by the window, the glow of the lamps painting her face in amber light. "You cannot protect them from the world forever," she said gently. "But you can show them how to stand in it without losing who they are." Ethan turned to her, his expression pained. "You believe that love can survive this kind of noise?" "It already has," she answered. "Every word they speak, every step they take, is louder than any headline." That night, while the twins slept, Grace sat beside their beds, whispering prayers she had learned long ago. Her words were not grand, only simple wishes for peace and strength. She knew how quickly the world could turn kindness into spectacle. She had seen it before: good people misunderstood, quiet hearts trampled by noise. The next morning, Ethan called a meeting with his attorney and publicist. "We will make a statement," he said. "We will set boundaries. No one will exploit them again." Grace listened quietly as the men discussed press releases, legal warnings, and privacy rights. She could see the fire in Ethan's eyes, but beneath it was something deeper: fear. When the meeting ended, she approached him. "You are doing the right thing," she said softly. "But remember, the truth does not need defending. It only needs living." He looked at her and nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "You always know how to make chaos sound like calm," he said. Grace smiled. "That is because I have lived long enough to know that storms pass, but people remain." Later that week, the first journalists were escorted away by the new security team. The gates of the mansion were reinforced, and a sign was placed outside reading, "Private residence, no media access." Slowly, the crowd began to thin, but just as the calm returned, a letter arrived, handwritten and unsigned, slipped through the gate one morning. Ethan opened it at breakfast. The words inside were brief. "Truth deserves light. Do not hide it behind walls." The letter carried no signature, only a pressed violet at the bottom. Grace studied it for a long time, her brow furrowing. "Someone believes this story belongs to everyone," she said. "Maybe they are right," Ethan murmured. "Maybe it does." But Grace shook her head. "The story belongs to those who lived it, not to those who watched it." Days turned into weeks, and gradually the noise faded. The cameras left, the reporters moved on, and silence returned to the estate, not the old, hollow silence of grief, but a quiet built from peace and healing. Grace resumed her lessons with the twins, who now walked short distances with assistance. Their laughter filled the halls once more. One afternoon, Ethan found them in the garden, dancing under the sun with ribbons tied around their wrists. Grace clapped along, her eyes shining. "You see?" she said. "They have turned the noise of the world into their own kind of music." Ethan watched them, his heart swelling. "They are stronger than I ever was," he said quietly. Grace looked at him. "That is because they learned from your love, not your fear." As evening came, the family gathered in the library for story time. Grace read aloud from an old children's book about courage, her voice steady and full of warmth. When she finished, Lila looked up and asked, "Miss Grace, are we famous?" Grace smiled softly. "Maybe for a little while," she said. "But fame is not what makes you special. What makes you special is that you loved even when it was hard." Liam nodded thoughtfully. "Then I want to be kind, not famous," he said. Ethan's eyes glistened as he pulled both children close. "That," he said, "is the best kind of famous there is." Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Ethan walked into the garden and found Grace sitting beneath the oak tree, her hands resting on her lap. "Do you ever wish it had all stayed quiet?" he asked. She thought for a moment before answering. "Quiet can keep us safe, but sometimes the world needs to hear what love can do." He nodded slowly, understanding her in a way he never had before. The moonlight glowed on the garden path, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. The air was cool, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. Somewhere inside the mansion, the faint melody of the music box began to play again, its notes drifting softly into the night. Grace looked toward the sound and whispered, "That is what healing sounds like, music you did not know was still playing." Ethan smiled, his heart full. The noise of the world had come and gone, but what remained was something far greater, the steady, enduring hum of love that refused to be silenced. As summer ripened into late August, the Caldwell mansion seemed to carry a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from sorrow but from peace after survival. The flowers in the garden stood tall, the sky stretched endlessly blue, and laughter had become the rhythm of each morning. Grace woke early every day, the sound of birds her signal to begin another lesson. The twins, now stronger and more confident, were able to walk a few steps on their own, and every step they took felt like a hymn of victory. Ethan had started joining them in the garden after breakfast, pushing aside business calls and meetings. "The world can wait," he often said, "but moments like these cannot." On one particularly warm afternoon, Grace noticed how Lila's steps had grown steadier, her gait smoother. Liam, too, could stand for longer without support. She watched them play by the fountain, their laughter echoing through the open air. "They are learning faster than I ever expected," she said softly. Ethan nodded beside her. "It feels like watching light learn to walk." Grace smiled. "Light never forgets how to shine, sir. It just waits to be noticed again." That evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, Ethan invited Grace to the library. The air smelled faintly of old books and cedar. On the large wooden table sat a folder. "These are letters," he said, "from families who saw the video. They have children with conditions like mine once had. They are asking for your help." Grace hesitated before sitting. "I am not a doctor," she said quietly. "I am only a woman who believes in patience and love." Ethan's eyes softened. "Sometimes that is more than medicine can give." She opened one of the letters. The words were shaky, written by a mother who had nearly lost hope. "She says she has prayed every night for someone to show her what faith looks like," Grace whispered. Ethan leaned forward. "Then perhaps it is time you showed them." The suggestion hung in the air like a gentle breeze. Grace looked uncertain. "You mean, leave here?" He nodded slowly. "Not forever, but maybe for a while. You could visit families, teach them what you taught us." She was silent for a long time, her gaze drifting toward the window where moonlight painted the floor in silver. "And who will teach them?" she finally asked, motioning toward the hallway where the twins slept. Ethan smiled. "They already know the lessons. They just have to live them now." Her heart tightened. She had known this moment would come, the moment when her purpose in one home would lead her toward another. But letting go, even for good reason, carried its own kind of ache. The next morning, Grace told the twins about the letters. "There are other children who need help," she said softly. Children who do not know yet how strong they are. Lila frowned. You are leaving? Grace knelt beside her. Only for a little while. You have your father, and you have each other. I will come back. Liam reached for her hand. Will you teach them to sing like us? Grace smiled, her eyes bright with tears. Yes, my star, I will teach them to sing. Ethan stood by the doorway, watching quietly. Pride and sorrow wove together inside him. Later that day, he helped her pack. It was a small suitcase, the same one she had carried when she first arrived at the mansion. You came with this, he said softly. And now you are leaving with it, but everything else has changed. Grace looked up at him. No, sir, I am not leaving with it. I am leaving with them in my heart. He nodded, unable to speak. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Grace walked through the garden one last time. The twins followed her, each holding one of her hands. When they reached the fountain, she turned to them. Do you remember what I told you about the world? She asked. That it can be loud, Lila said. Yes, Grace said. But your kindness can be louder, Liam added. And our hearts can sing even when it rains. Grace smiled. Exactly. Ethan stepped forward and placed a small box in her hand. Inside was a silver locket, engraved with 2 small stars. For when you need to remember the light you gave us, he said. She closed the locket gently and whispered, Thank you for letting me stay long enough to see love become real again. When the car arrived at the gate, the twins waved until it disappeared down the long driveway. Ethan stood behind them, his hands resting on their shoulders. The mansion felt quiet once more, but it was not the silence of emptiness, it was the calm of hearts full of gratitude. That night, Grace wrote in her notebook from her small inn by the road. Today, I said goodbye to a home that was never mine, yet somehow always was. Love is not about staying, it is about leaving light behind. Outside her window, the stars shimmered above the open road, and in the distance, the faint sound of a piano carried on the wind. It was Ethan, playing the melody she once hummed every morning. Grace closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that wherever she went, the song would follow her, carrying the echo of a family reborn by faith, courage, and the quiet power of love. Grace's journey began before the sun rose, the world still painted in shades of blue and silver. The car moved quietly along the winding country road, carrying her away from the mansion that had once been only a job and had become her purpose. She looked out at the passing fields, her reflection in the window faint and thoughtful. In her lap rested Ethan's gift, the silver locket with the 2 small stars. She touched it gently, whispering, Keep shining, my little ones. Miles away, back at the Caldwell estate, the morning unfolded differently than usual. The twins woke to find Grace's room empty, her familiar humming replaced by the quiet chirping of birds outside. For a moment, the silence felt strange, heavy. Lila ran to Ethan's study, clutching her bear. Dad, she said, Grace is gone. Ethan knelt down, pulling her close. She is helping other children now, he said softly. Just like she helped you. Liam stood in the doorway, his voice small but sure. She said she would come back. Ethan smiled. And she will. But while she is gone, we must keep what she taught us alive. That day, Ethan carried on their morning lessons himself. He played the same song Grace used to hum, guiding the twins as they practiced walking along the sunlit hallway. The rhythm was slower, the steps less certain, but the laughter was still there. You see, he said, Grace's song is still in the air. We just have to listen. Meanwhile, Grace arrived at her first stop, a small town outside of Boston. The community center was modest but full of warmth. Dozens of parents had gathered with their children, their faces filled with curiosity and hope. The organizer, a kind woman named Clara, greeted her with open arms. You are the woman who helped the Caldwell twins? Grace nodded modestly. I am just someone who believes in what love can do. When she entered the room, the children turned to look at her. Some were in wheelchairs, some held tightly to their parents' hands, others sat quietly with guarded eyes. Grace smiled and knelt to meet them at eye level. I am not here to fix you, she said gently. I am here to remind you how brave you already are. The first session was simple. She taught them a small game using rhythm and movement, the same one she had used with Liam and Lila months ago. At first, the children hesitated, unsure, but soon the room filled with clapping and laughter. Grace's heart swelled as she watched them discover joy through motion. When the day ended, a little boy with freckles approached her. "Will I walk one day too?" he asked. Grace knelt beside him and smiled. "You already are walking," she said. "You walk every time you try." The boy's mother wiped away tears, whispering, "Thank you." That night, Grace sat by the window of her small rented room, writing in her notebook by the light of a single lamp. "Today," she wrote, "I saw courage wearing the faces of children who have not yet learned what giving up means. The world is wide, and love has many names, but its work is always the same." Back at the mansion, Ethan was beginning to realize how much Grace's absence had changed him. He no longer filled his schedule with meetings. Instead, he spent his mornings teaching his children, his afternoons walking through the garden, and his evenings reading aloud from Grace's favorite book. The twins had started asking questions about everything: the stars, the wind, the sound of rain. One night, as they sat by the fire, Lila looked up and asked, "Dad, do you think Miss Grace can see the same stars we see?" Ethan smiled. "Yes, my love, the same ones." Liam pointed toward the sky. "Then if we talk to them, maybe she will hear." Ethan nodded. "Then let us talk to them together." The three of them sat in silence, staring at the night sky, whispering small wishes to the stars. Across the miles, Grace sat by her own window, looking at that same sky. The silver locket in her hand glowed softly in the moonlight. She closed her eyes, and in the stillness, she could almost hear their voices, the laughter, the song, the sound of tiny footsteps across a polished floor. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not from sadness but from gratitude. "You are not alone," she whispered. "None of us ever are." As days turned into weeks, Grace's message began to spread. Families wrote to her, inviting her to their towns, their schools, their homes. Her name became a quiet symbol of hope, not because she had performed miracles, but because she had reminded people that miracles begin in the simplest places: in patience, in touch, in love that refuses to give up. And somewhere far behind her, in a mansion once filled with silence, a family was still learning how to live by that same light. Grace closed her notebook for the night and whispered to the stars outside, "Where there is love, there is always a way home." The world outside was vast and dark, but the light that began in one house continued to move through it, steady and unending, like the heartbeat of something greater than all of them combined. Autumn rolled in gently, painting the world in shades of amber and rust. Grace's journey had taken her through small towns and quiet cities, places filled with stories that reminded her how wide the human heart could stretch. Every week, she met new families, parents with weary eyes and children with brave smiles. Each home held its own kind of silence, and in that silence, she found echoes of the mansion she had left behind. Her lessons were never about medicine or miracles. They were about faith and patience. She would kneel beside each child, showing them how to breathe through frustration, how to turn small movements into triumphs. One afternoon in a small church hall in Vermont, a boy named Michael stood for the first time with her guidance. His mother fell to her knees, sobbing into her hands. Grace held her gently and whispered, "Do not thank me. Thank the love that refused to give up." That night, alone in her rented room, Grace lit a small candle by the window and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Love is the only thing that multiplies when it is shared. Every child I meet reminds me that healing does not travel in one direction, it comes back to you." Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Ethan's home had changed in ways he never expected. The twins were growing fast, their steps stronger each day. The house was still full of laughter, but now Ethan felt something missing: a presence, a quiet rhythm that had once kept the mansion alive. He found himself walking into the playroom at night, half expecting to hear Grace humming. One evening, he sat at the piano, the same one she had used for their morning songs. He played her melody softly, his fingers trembling on the keys. The twins wandered in, sleepy-eyed, drawn by the sound. "That is Miss Grace's song," Lila said. Ethan nodded. "Yes, my love. I am just keeping it alive until she returns." Liam leaned against his father's arm. "Do you think she misses us?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I think she carries you wherever she goes." Far away, at that very hour, Grace closed her notebook and as if hearing the same invisible rhythm, began to hum the same tune under her breath. The melody bridged the miles between them, uniting them in silence and sound. Days turned into weeks, and soon letters began arriving for Grace, not from strangers this time, but from Ethan. He wrote of the twins' progress, their laughter, the way they now helped him cook breakfast on Sundays. Each letter ended the same way: "We are keeping your song alive." Grace read them by candlelight, tears filling her eyes. "My stars are still shining," she whispered. One afternoon, while teaching in a small community school in Maine, Grace received a call. It was Ethan. His voice was softer than she remembered, but steady. "Grace," he said, "there is something you should know. The twins are walking completely on their own." Grace gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "Completely?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "They wanted you to hear it from them." She could hear the rustle of movement on the other end of the line, and then two small voices came through together. "Miss Grace," they said, "we are walking." For a moment, Grace could not speak. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed the phone to her heart. "My loves," she whispered, "you have done what no one believed possible." Lila said, "We did it because you told us we could." Grace smiled through her tears. "No, my stars. You did it because you believed you could." That night, Grace could not sleep. She walked outside beneath a canopy of stars, the air crisp and cool. The world felt wide and close all at once. She whispered into the night, "Thank you, God, for letting me see light bloom where darkness once lived." Back at the mansion, Ethan stood by the same window, the moonlight falling across his face. He held one of the children's drawings in his hands, a picture of the family standing under a tree, with Grace drawn beside them, holding two stars. He whispered to the night, "You are still here." The following week, Ethan and the twins decided to surprise her. They traveled quietly to the town where she was teaching, arriving at the community center just as one of her classes ended. Grace was helping a small girl balance on a wooden beam when she looked up and froze. Ethan stood in the doorway, the twins beside him, their faces glowing. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lila ran forward, shouting, "Miss Grace," and threw her arms around her. Grace fell to her knees, holding both children close. "Look," Liam said proudly, "we can walk to you now." Grace's tears flowed freely as she kissed their foreheads. "You walked right into my heart," she said softly. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes misted. "We wanted you to see it for yourself." Grace smiled through her tears. "I am seeing more than that, sir. I am seeing the proof that love never stops growing." The room was silent, the air thick with emotion. Parents and children who had witnessed the reunion began to applaud quietly, some wiping their own tears. Grace stood and looked around, realizing that the love she had poured into one family had rippled outward, touching others in ways she had never imagined. As the applause faded, Ethan said, "I think it is time you came home." Grace looked at him, and then at the children. "Home is wherever love lives," she said. And in that moment, she knew that her journey, no matter where it took her, would always lead her back to them. Outside, the first autumn leaves began to fall, drifting through the open door like blessings carried on the wind. The return to the Caldwell estate felt like the closing of a circle. The long driveway was lined with trees wearing their autumn colors, and as the car approached the front gates, Grace felt her breath catch. It had been months since she had last seen the mansion, yet it looked both the same and completely changed. The moment the car stopped, the front doors opened, and the staff rushed out, their faces full of joy. The twins were the first to step out, truly running across the stone path toward the familiar front steps. Grace followed behind them, her heart racing. When she stepped into the grand hall, the air seemed to hum with memories. Every echo carried whispers of laughter, songs, and tears that had once filled these walls. Ethan stood near the staircase, watching her with an expression that was part pride, part awe. "Welcome home, Grace," he said simply. She smiled, her voice soft but steady. "It feels like I never left." The twins tugged at her hands, pulling her toward the playroom. "Come see," Lila said. "We made something for you." Inside, the walls were covered with their drawings, flowers, stars, trees, and stick figures holding hands beneath the words, "Our Family." In the center of the room stood a small wooden chest. "What is this?" Grace asked. "A treasure box," Liam said proudly. "We put all the things that remind us of you inside." Grace knelt, opening the box carefully. Inside were small tokens: a ribbon she had once tied in Lila's hair, a broken crayon, a pebble from the garden, and a folded piece of paper. She opened it slowly. It was one of the first notes she had written to Ethan months ago, reminding him not to lose faith. Her eyes filled with tears. "You kept this?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "We kept everything that reminded us of who we became because of you." That evening, they all gathered for dinner, the long table glowing under the soft light of chandeliers. For the first time in years, the house felt full not because of guests or noise, but because love had found its way into every corner. Grace listened as the twins talked about their dreams. "I want to be a teacher like you," Lila said proudly. "And I want to build houses," Liam added. "Big houses where children can come to feel safe." Ethan smiled, his eyes warm. "I think both of those are the best ideas I have ever heard," Grace laughed softly. "You will do wonderful things, my stars." After dinner, as the children prepared for bed, Ethan and Grace stood on the balcony, overlooking the garden. The moon hung low, its silver light glinting on the fountain below. "When you left," he said quietly, "I realized something. You did not just heal my children, you healed me. You made me remember what it means to be human again." Grace looked at him, her voice calm but full of emotion. "I did not heal anyone, sir. I just listened long enough for love to speak." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then maybe love has been speaking this whole time, and I just never had the ears to hear it." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind cool and gentle against their faces. From the twins' room came the faint sound of singing the same lullaby Grace had taught them long ago. Ethan turned to her. "They still sing your song every night," he said. Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. "It is their song now." The following morning, Grace found the twins in the garden, teaching the gardener's young son how to balance on the stepping stones by the pond. "You have to be brave," Lila told him. "If you fall, you just try again." Grace watched from a distance, her heart swelling. Ethan joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. "They are teaching now," he said. "You gave them more than strength, you gave them purpose." She turned to him, smiling softly. "Then maybe it is time for me to do the same." He looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "I want to open a place," she said. "A home for children like them, a place filled with music and kindness instead of machines and fear." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "You will not do it alone," he said. "Whatever you need, I will help you." Grace placed a hand over her heart. "Thank you," she said. "But this time, it will not be about saving anyone. It will be about reminding them they were never lost." Later that afternoon, the twins joined them under the oak tree. Lila lay back on the grass, looking up at the sky. "The clouds look like angels," she said. Liam pointed to one that looked like a heart. Grace laughed softly. "Maybe they are all the same thing," she said. Ethan sat beside them, his voice quiet. "You have turned this house into something sacred, Grace." She looked at him, the sunlight catching her hair. "No," she said. "We all did. Love did." As the day faded into twilight, the air filled with the sound of the twins' laughter and the soft rustle of leaves overhead, Grace closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun still lingering on her skin. She realized that life had brought her full circle, not back to where she began, but to where she was meant to stay, surrounded by love that had learned how to stand, walk, and finally, run free. In the quiet that followed, Ethan looked at her and whispered, "You were right all along. Healing is remembering how to love." And for the first time, Grace allowed herself to believe that she had truly come home. The following weeks unfolded like a dream built on gratitude. The Caldwell mansion, once silent and cold, had become a living place of music, laughter, and warmth. Grace began working with Ethan to bring her vision of a healing home for children to life. The twins called it the Star House because, as Lila said, it is where little lights learn to shine again. They turned the old guest house on the edge of the property into a small center filled with color, sunlight, and space to play. Grace decorated the walls with hand-painted stars and soft shades of blue. Ethan handled the logistics, permits, funding, supplies, while Grace focused on creating a world where every child could feel seen. The twins helped too, proudly showing other children how to walk, move, and dream again. The first day the Star House opened, Grace stood at the door in her simple blue dress, welcoming each family as if they were old friends. Mothers came holding children in wheelchairs. Fathers came carrying their sons and daughters in their arms. Grace greeted each one with the same warmth, her smile a quiet promise that they were safe. Inside, laughter replaced fear. The sound of small hands clapping to the rhythm of Grace's songs filled the air. Ethan watched from the doorway, his eyes soft. "You have done it," he said. Grace shook her head gently. "We have done it." As days passed, word spread quickly. Families from nearby towns began visiting, each drawn by stories of kindness and change. Grace made sure that no one felt like a patient. "Here," she would say, "you are not broken, you are becoming." The twins became little helpers, guiding new friends through games, encouraging them with patience only children could possess. Lila had even started keeping a journal of her own, where she drew pictures of every new child they met. One afternoon, a soft rain began to fall outside while Grace was teaching a small boy named Daniel how to balance. He was shy, his voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot do it," he said, trembling. Grace knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You do not have to do it today," she said. "You only have to believe that one day you will." Slowly, the boy smiled. Ethan, standing by the window, watched the exchange and felt something stir deep inside him, a recognition of what true strength looked like. That evening, when the last family had gone home, Grace sat by the window of the Star House, looking out at the rain. The twins were painting at a small table nearby, their laughter echoing softly. Ethan entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You should rest," he said. "You have been working since dawn." She smiled. "Rest can wait. This place is alive now." He set the cups down and took a seat beside her. "When I first met you," he said, "I thought you were just a maid." Grace chuckled softly. "And now?" He looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. "Now I know you were sent here for something far greater." She looked out the window, her voice low. "Maybe I was just meant to remind you that love never needed to be earned." He nodded. "And you did." For a while, they sat in silence, watching the rain fall over the garden. Then Ethan spoke again. "I have been thinking about something. You built this home for the children, but I want to make it permanent. A foundation, in your name." Grace's eyes widened. "In my name?" He smiled. "Yes, the Grace Foundation for Healing Through Compassion." She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "It is not about me." "It is," he said gently, "because you taught us all that compassion is not weakness, it is courage." The next morning, Ethan called a press conference, but this time it was not about wealth or power. It was about love turned into action. Standing before the cameras, he said, "This is not a story about miracles. It is a story about what happens when kindness meets faith. We are opening the Grace Foundation, a place where love is the only treatment plan." Grace watched from the side, her hands clasped tightly. When the conference ended, reporters tried to approach her, but Ethan shielded her from the noise. "She does not need the spotlight," he told them. "Her work speaks for itself." That night, after everyone had gone, the family gathered under the oak tree in the garden. The air was cool and full of cricket songs. The twins sat on a blanket, holding the silver locket Ethan had once given Grace. "Can we open it again?" Lila asked. Grace nodded. Inside were 2 small stars, polished and glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Those stars are you," she said. "You light every place you go." Ethan looked at her, his voice soft. "And you, Grace, are the light that showed us the way." The night sky stretched above them, endless and full of shimmering constellations. The wind rustled the leaves gently, as if the world itself was whispering approval. Grace closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not for more blessings, but simply for gratitude. Around her sat a family that had once been broken, a home that had once been hollow, and a future that now pulsed with hope. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt no need to move forward or look back. She was exactly where love had wanted her to be. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping the Caldwell estate in a soft white stillness. The snow covered the garden like a blanket, each flake glimmering in the pale morning light. From the windows of the Star House, the sound of laughter drifted out, children chasing one another, their footprints marking trails of joy across the untouched snow. Grace stood by the door, watching them, her heart full. The twins were older now, taller and stronger, their steps confident, as they helped younger children build snowmen near the fountain. Ethan approached from behind, his coat dusted with snow, carrying 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. "I never thought the sound of chaos could be so beautiful," he said with a smile. Grace turned to him, her breath visible in the cold air. "Chaos," she replied softly, "is just love learning how to dance." He laughed quietly, handing her a mug. "You always find the right words." She looked at him, her expression warm but thoughtful. "No," she said, "I just listen until the right words come." Together they watched as Lila helped a little girl who had fallen, whispering the same words Grace had once told her. "You are strong. You can try again." Liam, nearby, was teaching a boy how to balance on the icy path. The sight filled Ethan with pride and awe. "They have become you," he said. Grace shook her head gently. "They have become themselves. I only reminded them who they were." Inside, the fire burned bright. The children came running in, their cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Grace helped them remove their coats, hanging them by the fireplace. "Hot cocoa for everyone," she said, her voice filled with warmth. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the air, blending with the sound of laughter. Ethan watched her move among the children, steady, patient, full of grace in every sense of the word. When the room quieted, he spoke softly. "Do you ever think about what your life might have been if you had never come here?" She paused for a moment, looking into the fire. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember that love never asks where it began. It only asks where it can go next." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. That evening, as twilight painted the sky, the family gathered in the garden for their annual tree, lighting a new tradition born from the light Grace had brought into their lives. The children hung small paper stars on the branches, each one carrying a wish written in their own handwriting. When it came time to light the tree, Ethan handed the match to Grace. "This is your light," he said. She smiled softly. "It belongs to all of us now." The tree came alive with golden light, its reflection shimmering in the snow. The children gasped, their eyes wide with wonder. Grace looked up at the glowing branches, and for a moment, she felt as though the stars themselves had descended to rest among them. After the celebration, when the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, Grace walked out to the garden alone. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the snow. She stood beneath the tree, closing her eyes. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying faint echoes of laughter. Ethan joined her after a while, his footsteps soft on the snow. "You built all of this," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "Love built it. I just made space for it to grow." He looked at her, his eyes gentle. "Then promise me something, Grace. Promise me that wherever you go next, you will keep building." She smiled, the kind of smile that carries both peace and promise. "I will," she said, "but maybe for the first time, I do not need to go anywhere." They stood in silence for a long while, watching as snow began to fall again, each flake glowing under the golden light of the tree. Inside the house, the twins stirred in their sleep, whispering softly in their dreams, "Thank you, Miss Grace." The sound carried faintly through the halls, wrapping around her heart like a final lullaby. Grace looked up at the sky, her breath forming small clouds of silver in the cold air. "You are welcome, my stars," she whispered. "Keep shining." As the night deepened, the lights of the mansion glowed like beacons against the dark, a symbol of everything they had endured and everything they had become. Grace turned to leave the garden, her footsteps leaving a trail that the morning sun would soon erase. But the warmth she had given, the love, the courage, the light would remain. In the stillness of that winter night, It was clear that no miracle had ever truly ended. It had only learned how to live, quietly, in the hearts of those who believed. And so, under a sky filled with stars, the woman who had once been a maid, the children who had once been voiceless, and the man who had once forgotten how to love all, stood united by the same truth: that the smallest act of kindness can change the course of a life, and that sometimes, the most powerful miracles are the ones born simply from love,